Welcome. I declare this meeting of the Port Phillip City Council open, and I welcome the members of the public who are here tonight. The City of Port Phillip respectfully acknowledges the Yalukit Willam clan of the Boonwurrung. We pay our respects to their elders, both past and present, and we acknowledge and uphold their traditional relationship to this land. Council has a local law that determines how this meeting will be conducted. There is a time allotted in tonight's agenda for public question time. During public question time, members of the public can ask specific questions on general matters other than those relating to a topic that's on the agenda for tonight. Members of the public are only to ask a specific question and shall not provide any statements or contextual comments relating to that question. Consequently, the official minutes of the meeting will only record the question asked and any response given. The number of questions that a member of the public may ask shall be at the discretion of the chairperson. There is also an opportunity for members of the public to ask a question or make a comment on a specific item on tonight's agenda. This will be done prior to Council considering the item. We encourage comments and questions from members of the public that are directed through the Mayor, are not defamatory, abusive or objectionable in language or substance, rather are presented in a spirit of mutual respect for the Council and the community. And we ask all members, all speakers, to abide by the direction of the Chair. If you wish to ask a question or speak to a report, please complete the blue form that's located just outside the chamber on the table and hand it to a staff member. I encourage you to try and limit your questions and comments to around 3 minutes and to avoid repeating any points that have already been made by other speakers. And please note that all council meetings are now being live streamed. Live streaming and recording allows the community to watch and listen to the meetings in real time, providing greater access to the council decision-making and debate and improving openness and transparency. The live stream of this meeting is available on Council's website, and the recording of this meeting will also be available to view on Council's website after about 48 hours. The cameras will film and record councillors at this meeting. However, care is taken not to film or record images of members of the public. If a member of the public asks a question or makes a comment about an agenda item, they will not be filmed, but their voice will be heard in the live stream and recorded. And please also note, in accordance with Council's local law, that this meeting cannot be audio or videotaped unless permission is granted by the Mayor. We'll go to item number 1, which is apologies. Councillors, do we have any apologies? Councillor Gross, can you put your microphone on?
Sorry. Councillor Simic and who else? Councillor Pearl.
Councillor Simic and Councillor Pearl, do I have a seconder? Councillor Bond to second. I will then put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried. We'll move to the minutes of the previous meeting. Councillors, the minutes of the ordinary meeting held on the 16th of August 2017 have been circulated. Are there any questions regarding these minutes? So there are not. Can I have a motion to confirm these minutes? Councillor Bond and Councillor Copsey to second. I'll now put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. We'll move to item number 3, which is declarations of conflicts of interest. Does any councillor have a conflict of interest in any matters being discussed at tonight's meeting? There are none. Item 4 is petition and joint letters. And councillors, we've got 3 petitions tonight. I'll hear them in the order that they're on the agenda. So petition number 1, which is 4.1, requesting a review of our local law in relation to rubbish bin storage. No. So we have no members of the public that have requested to speak to that. I can see you've got your hand up there, sir. You should have done a blue sheet. If you would still want to speak to, please go out and do a blue sheet and I'll go to the next item. So we'll come back to 4.1. 4.2 is the petition in relation to a proposal to install temporary speed cushions on Tennyson Street, Elwood, between Dickens Street and Milton Street. And we don't have anyone that's requested to speak to that item. So, councillors, do you have any questions of the officers on that item? There are none. Councillors, we've got an officer's recommendation. Would someone like to move this or something different? Councillor Crawford to move, Councillor Baxter to second. Councillor Crawford, would you like to speak to the motion?
I feel that the motion, the recommendation by the officers finds the middle ground to address all of the issues that various parties mentioned in regard to the Tennyson thing. So I'm happy to accept this recommendation.
Councillor Baxter?
Just to add that I know this street very, very well, and I think this is an appropriate treatment for the street.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to the motion? Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. So we'll go to item 4.2 then? 4.3. 4.3. Yep. Yes, so 4.3 is a petition in relation to residents of Bath Streets in Kilda asking to be permitted to park for longer than 2 hours under their parking permits. And we haven't got anyone that's requested to speak to that item. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? I note there are none. So we have an officer's recommendation, councillors. Do I have a mover for that or something different? Councillor Bond to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Gross to second. Councillor Bond, would you like to speak? Councillor Gross, would you like to speak to the...
No, thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to the motion? If not, I'll put that motion. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you. So we'll go back to item 4.1. I'd like to call on Mr Nicholas Abu Carter, please, to come forward. If you would take a seat at that front desk, please, Mr Abu Carter, and turn the microphone on. If you'd state your name and suburb for the record. And just for everyone else, we're going back to the petition requesting to review our local law in relation to rubbish bin storage. Thank you.
My name is Nicholas Abu Carter. I live at... Press it harder is the rule. Nicholas Abu Carter. I live at 1 Wilkinson Lane in Elwood. I and my neighbours are hoping that the current bylaw, which simply requires people to store their garbage bins on their side of the property line, could be changed to resolve the issue of flats storing multiple garbage bins along their fence line, causing a significant eyesore. Unfortunately, we've got 3 blocks of flats in a row in our sort of little area which do this. It has for some time been a requirement of new planning applications that garbage bins have a place to be stored, and it would make sense for this to be the requirement for all properties where possible. And all of these flats could store their bins differently at no or little cost, and I have asked nicely the property managers and have had no response. But I think it'd be a nice way to clean up some parts of our municipality. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your submission, Mr Abu Carter. I note that it's being tabled tonight, and there'll be a response in a couple of weeks at another council meeting. So, councillors, do you have any questions of the officers in relation to this report? Then we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover? Councillor Gross to move, Councillor Baxter to second. I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Item 5 is the sealing schedule, and councillors, we don't have any documents requiring sealing tonight. Item 6 is public question time. And in public question time, we've had one member of the public that's requested to speak tonight. I'd like to ask Mr. Isaac Herman. Mr. Herman, if you would come forward. If you could pop on the microphone and state your name and suburb for the record. Thank you.
Isaac Herman from Elwood. Good evening, Madam Mayor, councillors, CEO and council officers. I seek some clarity on a broad and a not specifically local issue, and perhaps a continuation of the April 2012 Council Reconciliation Action Plan discussions, which I believe was ratified by this council some short months ago, though it is unclear whether any discussions were held surrounding references to Australia Day, as opposed to Survival or Invasion Day, or indeed the appropriateness of celebrating a national holiday that is so demeaning to our Indigenous peoples, as they themselves have expressed from Australia Day's outset in the 1930s. Do you not feel that this is a question of national significance that is asking us to take in views from right across this land? With sensitivity to Aboriginal custom, I express my intention respectfully to show you an image of Aboriginal protesters in 1938 and make mention of a significant Aboriginal leader now passed. May I pass these copies on to you now? Just those two. I ask now, are councillors aware of our long-held traditions relating to the celebration of Separation Day, or Separation Proclamation Day, Empire Day, Wattle Day, or even Guy Fawkes Night, all once held sacrosanct, though all have passed on into history? Our current Australia Day has perhaps only been celebrated right across the country since the mid-1990s, and the presentation of Australian citizenship ceremonies were never exclusively tied to this day. Here, I have my parents' naturalisation certificates, indeed presented at St Kilda Town Hall on the 27th of March 1961. Will Council open up the debate and consult with community and give respect to the words of significant Aboriginal leaders such as William Cooper, who saw the 26th of January as a day of mourning and protest? Would you expect Irish Catholics to celebrate the arrival of Cromwell? Would you expect Native Americans to celebrate on Columbus Day? Would you expect Greeks to celebrate the Asia Minor catastrophe? Would you expect Jews to celebrate Kristallnacht? While these comparisons are broad and generalised, they do all point to an inhumane proposition that the vanquished and dispossessed may find it appealing to celebrate a marker signifying their own demise. Would you? I look forward to hearing your views. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Herman. I'd like to ask Ms. Jeffs if you would come forward and speak to some of those questions, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So the Reconciliation Action Plan was renewed earlier this year, and the local Indigenous and Aboriginal community was consulted during that renewal and review process. I don't believe that the current matter that Mr. Herman was articulating today was extensively or in fact discussed at all, and so it remains a question for Council to consider, if at all. But I think it's important to note City of Port Phillip's leadership in the Reconciliation Action Plan space and the good work that's been done over a long period of time now, and that the mature relationships that we have with local communities, and the fact that we have a second reconciliation action plan is significant. And most of the actions, in fact all of them in the first one, were completed, and there's a series of actions in the second one which is innovative, inspiring, and shows this council as a leader in this space.
Thank you, Ms. Jeffs. We'll move now to item 7, which is councillor question time. Councillors, are there any questions for the officers? Councillor Copsey.
Thank you, Mayor. So we've heard that it's mission accomplished in relation to finding replacement accommodation for people who were left without housing following the closure of the Gatwick. My question is everyone who was relocated from the Gatwick still in housing, to our knowledge? And is there monitoring in place to ensure that they continue in housing and don't become homeless? And if so, who's undertaking this monitoring and what does it consist of?
Thank you, Councillor Copsey. I'll ask Ms Jeffs to come forward and update us on the status of those that were housed in the Gatwick.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The process for the Gatwick transition and rehoming of Gatwick residents was a very intensive multi-agency effort. The intensity was around the individual case management that occurred for each of the residents, and so as part of that, not only was it about a rehousing but a significant wraparound group of services for each of those residents, and a period of time to ensure that they were secured in their new housing, and monitoring 3, 6 and 12 months post rehousing. So that is all happening. I will need to take on notice the detail of the monitoring and what it consists of, but that is that the St Kilda Community Housing Group was tasked with the rehoming, and we will be working closely with them on the follow-up as well. So it was a very well thought through and executed process. My understanding is that the residents felt significantly supported through that process, and some quite different and tailored responses resulted from the work. As multi-agency groups, we're learning from that experience to think about how we can collectively do this work better going forward.
Thank you, Ms Jeffs. Any other questions from councillors during councillor question time? Councillor Gross?
Look, sorry, I should have foreshadowed this, but I didn't. Just a follow-up from Isaac's question. Ms Jeffs, I just wondered, are officers at the moment considering any papers or investigations into these new issues that have arisen around Australia Day, or 26th of January, at the moment?
Through you, Madam Mayor, no, that's not. There's nothing that officers are preparing without council direction.
Thanks very much.
Any further questions, councillors?
Well,
Councillor Gross.
I just might follow up in saying that I've been speaking to colleagues around this, and I may be producing a notice of motion at the next meeting of council. So it's not a question, I apologise, but just a clarification.
Any other questions, councillors? There are none. Then, councillors, I wish to add an item to the agenda regarding a condolence motion for the recent passing of Minister Fiona Richardson. So can I please have the following motion, that council adds to the agenda a condolence motion for the recent passing of Minister Fiona Richardson. So I'm asking for a mover, please. Councillor Gross to move, Councillor Crawford to second. So thank you. I'll now put the motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. So my motion is, on behalf of the Port Phillip community, the Mayor, councillors and the CEO of Port Phillip Council expresses its deepest sympathies to the family, friends and colleagues of Minister Fiona Richardson as the Member for Northcote and Minister for the Prevention of Family Violence. The Port Phillip City Council acknowledges and thanks Fiona for her dedication to improving safety for all women and children across Victoria. So after a seconder for that motion, please. That was to... Thank you, Councillor Gross. Councillor Copsey to second. Councillor Gross, would you also like to speak to that motion?
I mean, this is a terrible thing that's happened to one of the great contemporary Victorians, struck down by an illness in the prime of her vocational life, it's a disaster that should be noted, and I thank Madam Mayor for facilitating this. The work that the former Minister Fiona Richardson has done in the area of family violence was spectacularly moving, arrestingly compelling, and absolutely necessary. And as time goes on, we're understanding just how family violence is at the core of so many crimes, and its victims end up often overrepresenting in the criminal justice system. She took this crusade on and exposed her own self to the sort of examination by public media that only a very brave person would do. So I really commend you for enabling us to move this and talk about the disaster of her premature death and the splendour and necessity for her passionate work.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Councillor Copsey, would anyone else like to speak to the motion? Then I'll now put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. Now we'll move to item 8, which is the presentation of reports. Firstly, we'll go to item number 1. And item... Just a minute. Item number 1 is the proposed report of operations for the annual report 2016-17. And we've got nobody that's requested to speak to that item from the members of the public. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? Councillor Brand?
Just one very, very, very minor one. I just wonder if the committees that Councillor Bond has reported to be on could be checked for accuracy. I think there's a mistake in it, or 2 mistakes. Might as well do our proofreading in public.
Happy, through you, Madam Mayor, happy to undertake to do that. Thank you, Councillor Brand.
Councillor Copsey?
Yes, for the benefit of those watching at home and those here in the chamber, if the officers could just give a quick overview of the function of this report and its what will happen to it from here.
Thank you. Ms Harris?
Through you, Madam Mayor, the purpose of this report is a statutory obligation on all local governments in Victoria to do by the 30th of September every year to reflect on the achievements of the council in the 12 months prior, including its financial performance, a report on its general operations and the performance statement. So it's got those 3 component parts. 2 of those component parts are audited independently and are the subject of a separate report tonight. This report of operations is more the narrative around the council's achievements for the year. It's, as you can see, it's a very strong result that the council's achieved, with 98% of council plan actions being on track and 86% of targets being met. The work of council is very broad and all-encompassing, and we go to considerable efforts to try and portray that in a compelling way for the community. So we have, although the information you have now is in an unpublished form, hopefully you can see that it gives the information in a range of different forms, from a chronological view to a spatial view by neighbourhood and by council plan theme. So from here, what happens, it's been considered and endorsed by the Audit and Risk Committee. If you're happy with the report, from here it goes into the production process and it gets submitted to the Minister for Local Government on the 30th of September, and the final version will be presented back to you in finished form on the 18th of October.
Thank you, Ms Harris. Any further questions, councillors? There are none. So we have an officer's recommendation, councillors. Do I have a mover for that or something different? Councillor Copsey to move. Councillor Brand to second. Councillor Copsey, would you like to speak to the motion?
Thank officers for the hard work that goes into producing this. It's a really vital document, and it's a great source of information for anyone who's interested in the operations of council and how the organisation is working for the community and how we're measuring up to the promises that we've laid out in our council plan. So, thank you.
Councillor Brand, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, I'll just say how proud I am that I read every word of it, but because I tell you, I'm the sort of person that finds annual reports and all of that paraphernalia sort of actually rather boring, and I was very impressed with it, and I found it easy to read and informative. I learned a few things, and I do commend it to the public. It is actually a good compendium of everything that we're doing, and it's been everything we've done over the last year. Well organised, well written, well tabulated, well explained, and that stands as a pretty good record, I think, of what's been happening with this council. So I commend it and thank the people who wrote it.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Anybody else like to speak to the motion? I will briefly speak to it. That it makes me very proud to be a councillor. This last year obviously spans the last 6 months of the previous council and the first 6 months of this council. And, you know, looking through the list of things that have been achieved is really quite incredible. I don't know how we even fitted in going to the openings of things. So, you know, from the St Kilda Lifesaving Club opening to the Palais Theatre refurbishment opening, live streaming, you know, has started up. The Elster Creek Forum is starting. There are so many things that we've managed to achieve and do, and they're just the big chunky ones. There's a whole lot of other things that really matter as well. So thank you very much to the officers for putting all this together. It's I noted it's in draft and it'll look pretty fancy when it comes back in print form, but it's easy reading, it's in plain language, and I think you've done a great job, so well done. Thank you. So with that, Councillor Copsey, would you like to close?
I'll just echo your comment that it does span not only this council's term but the end of the term of the previous council, and thank that council, as is noted in the report, for their stellar efforts and putting us in a position to put forward such a strong list of achievements.
Then I will now put that motion. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Move to item 8.2, which is the in-principle approval of the annual financial statements 2016-17 and the performance statement. There are no members of the public that have requested to speak. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? Councillor Brand?
I wonder if one of the officers would, for the public, just briefly explain the spectacular $33 million surplus that we've made, which isn't really exactly how I've made it out to be. It just needs some explanation. The explanation's in there, but I just think it's good just to point out, just to make an explanation of it in public.
Councillor Brand. Mr O'Keefe.
Sure. Through you, Madam Mayor. Yes, the $33 million is basically the operating result, Councillor, for the year. The net underlying result is a more modest $2.5 million. What makes up the bulk of the difference between the $33 million and the 2.5 is really related to an accounting standard regarding revenue recognition for non-monetary contributions. The Palais and the Stoke House make up $20 million, where effectively the council was provided with those assets with respect to the Stoke House. It was a contribution from the leaseholder beyond the insurance payout, and for the pallet it was the contribution from the state government. So that is the 20 million. There are other items that are actually making up that 33, about 8 or 9 million with respect to other contributions as well, monetary contributions.
Thank you, Mr O'Keefe. Councillor Brandon, a follow-up? Yep.
Yes, can I just say that I'm very happy to announce an underlying surplus of $2.5 million, which I think is great.
Anybody else wishing to ask a question on the report? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that or something different? Councillor Crawford to move, Councillor Baxter to second. Councillor Crawford, would you like to speak? Councillor Baxter, would you like to speak?
I'll speak very briefly and just say that I've been doing a course recently that made these accounts much easier to read, and they look fantastic.
Good to hear, Councillor Baxter. Would anyone else like to speak to the motion? If not, I'll put that motion. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll move to item 8.3, which is the post-budget initiatives, 2017-18. We have no members of the public that have requested to speak, but I would like to point out there is a very small typo at point 1.3. It misses a 0, but the comma is in the right spot. It says 37,00 and it should be 37,000. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? I would like to ask a question regarding the two big items in the post-budget initiatives, being the cladding on the building, and if you could just speak to the process around that, please, and also the other, and the telephones, please. Thanks.
Through you, Madam Mayor. As you say, the two significant items relate to the VBA cladding audit. As you know, this is a matter of some import and risk with respect to buildings being clad in combustible cladding. We have obviously reacted, as many other councils have, to this issue with respect to the VBA providing guidance around how councils should respond to this. Our officers have considered how we should respond. We believe we need to invest $250,000 to ensure that we can carry out this work in accordance with the guidelines from the VBA. With respect to the telephony, Council would be aware that this year and next year there was $500,000 in our budget for each year with respect to replacing the current telephony system and contact centre software within Council. It's past end of life, so to speak, and basically just hanging in there. We've taken the view with Council, with officers' input, that we should, if possible, use $500,000 from our asset renewal and smart technology reserve to actually spend, instead of $1 million over 2 years, to actually spend that $1 million this year, so that we can actually take advantage of ensuring that the design process is then followed up with the implementation process as quickly as feasible.
Thank you, Mr O'Keefe. So that still gives us a cash surplus.
Yes, you will note that those items in particular, the VBA cladding issue, is covered by a budget savings on work cover that we have since become aware of since the budget was adopted, and the $500,000 is currently in the reserve, waiting to be used for this purpose. We would still expect to deliver the budgeted cash surplus as per the budget. Councillors, any questions on the report?
If not, there is an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that or something different? Councillor Bond to move. Councillor Baxter to second. Councillor Bond, would you like to speak? Councillor Baxter, would you like to speak? Would anyone else like to speak? Then I will put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. So we'll move to item 8.4, which is the new leases for the childcare centres and kindergartens. We have one member of the public that's requested to speak. I'd like to ask Miss Brenda Forbath, please, to come forward. And you might need a chair there. That seems to have disappeared. All right. If you could pop on the microphone and state your name and suburb, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and Councillors. Brenda Forbath from Elwood. I'm coming to the microphone tonight to ask about the 3 childcare centres that will only receive a 1.5-year lease. That's the Avenue Children's Centre, the Elwood Children's Centre and the Eildon Road Children's Centre. And I notice that over the page in the report at 3.3.2, the report refers to the fact that there are some problems with these centres relating to the building conditions, the functionality and compliance. I'd like to have some explanation about what those problems are and what is being done to ensure that the centres can remain open. Clearly, there's a great concern about the loss of 3 childcare centres, which would amount to quite a number of childcare places for the municipality at a time where childcare places are very scarce on the ground. So I'd like to have some explanation of that and where we're heading with it and how we can ensure that those centres remain open. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Forbath. Ms Jeffs. You're able to answer those questions, please?
Yes, through you, Madam Mayor. The 3 childcare centres that have been mentioned are the buildings are owned by council. They're community-run centres by community committees of management, and they do host quite a number of childcare places. These 3 centres have been with council for some time, and the actual facilities are nearing end of life. In terms of what council's been doing, we've significantly increased maintenance with those 3 centres in recent years to maintain their operating capability and compliance. They're still operating now and doing very well. And there will be some consideration for council going forward about those centres, and at the moment there is every intention of council continuing commitment to childcare in the city, but it is a decision for council about those centres because they're so old, are likely to require a lot of money and potentially some time to renew, and it's just a key decision point for council. Just to add further, Madam Mayor, council officers have been liaising closely with the committees of management of those 3 centres, keeping them informed and listening to concerns that they have about the current conditions of their centres. So that process is ongoing.
Thank you, Ms Jeffs. I'm just wondering, so this is a statutory process that we're looking at tonight. Are you able to just elaborate a little bit on that process, please? Oh.
I think I might leave that to Mr Graffin, who's running the statutory process, Madam Mayor.
Hello, Mr Graffin. If you could answer that question, please, that'd be great.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The statutory process requires that leases of a period between 1 and 10 years, and where the actual or the market rent is greater than $50,000 per annum, they must undergo a statutory process which requires council to advertise a notice of intention to lease and call for submissions from interested persons. After the advertisement, council will be required to consider submissions before making a final decision about the leases. Further to this, there are some Crown land leases, and those leases will have to be signed off by the Minister.
Thank you, Mr Graffin. Councillors, any further questions? Then we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that or something different? Councillor Crawford to move. Councillor Gross to second. Councillor Crawford, would you like to speak to the motion? Councillor Gross?
Look, the only thing I wanted to say was addressing the issue of the 3 on shorter tenancies. There are diseconomies of scale. Sometimes you have a small, lovely childcare centre that beats anything that a large factory can provide. These 3 fit that model of being small, intimate, huge community affection by the parents and the surrounding community. But for over a decade now, there's been an issue about have the buildings reached the end of their useful life? I absolutely have no idea what's going to be on those sites in 5 years' time. Will they be a childcare centre or will they not? What I can say is that there's no way that any renovation or restructuring or whatever happens will lead to a diminution of the childcare places available to be run by those 3 communities. The question is, and I think we've got the flexibility to talk about it with this shorter lease period, is how do we make them possible to work, given that the building fabric is deteriorating and there's some questions of whether they work as childcare centres now. So all we have now with this attenuated lease period is a little bit of flexibility. You know, if I was a betting man, I'd probably bet on no change, but I have to say that flexibility is good. Flexibility will lead to, hopefully better provision of more childcare places, not less.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Would anyone else like to speak to the motion? I'll also just briefly say that our community very clearly values childcare and kindergarten, and that certainly I've personally have benefited from what the council run childcare and kindergartens. So I certainly endorse us going out to the communities for this statutory process. I also think it's excellent practice to provide an estimate of the value that council's providing to the community in relation to subsidisation of leases, and in this case it's $1.5 million. So the leases are up for a peppercorn rent of $10 per annum, which is appropriate for these not-for-profit centres that provide such incredible value. But it's also important to understand what the value is that is being delivered by that peppercorn rent. So those leases that are in that list, the number that doesn't cover the entire sector. There are certainly other centres not included in this list, such as other council-run facilities and other leases that are not up for renewal, such as Bubup Wominjeka in Port Melbourne. So I certainly endorse this process. Councillor, who's moved it? Sorry, Councillor Crawford, would you like to close? No. Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. We'll move to item 8.5, which is the proposed discontinuance and sale of road part R2975 between 17 Coventry Place and 378 Coventry Street, South Melbourne. And we have a member of the public that's requested to speak. I'd like to ask Mr Cherry from SJB Planning to come forward, please. Mr Cherry, if you'd state your name and suburb, please.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Richard Cherry from SJB Planning, South Bank. I'm here on behalf of the owners of 376 Coventry Street in South Melbourne. Thank you for your time. I'd like to state off the top that my clients support the officer recommendation, being option 2 of the council report in full. I'd like to use this time to provide some background information so that I can explain why my clients support the officer's recommendation. In January of this year, my clients lodged a planning permit application for the construction of a 2-storey addition at their property. The application plans were designed on the basis that the road in question could be relied upon for access during construction if a planning permit was to be granted. The property itself was bought on this basis as well. The planning application subsequently received an objection from the owner of 378 Coventry Street, which thus triggered my clients to revisit and reconsider the design and revise the plans. Accordingly, a Section 57A amendment application was lodged with Council and remains under active consideration by the Planning Department. Whilst having rights to the road in question, my clients were only made aware of its proposed discontinuance and sale through the Port Phillip leader in March 2017, after their planning permit application was lodged with Council. As was declared in our submission at the 19 July Council meeting, my clients have rights over this road and potential future pedestrian and/or vehicular access, and the road can get a 3.5 tonne excavator and standard size bobcat down it, which will help with demolition and excavation. The wall at the end of the road will be demolished and rebuilt under the current planning permit application, and when demolished, the road will provide full access into the property. In any event, as no planning decision has been made, further changes to the plans may still be required, further reason to support Council's recommendation. We strongly submit that the discontinuance and sale of the road is premature and should not proceed whilst the planning permit application that relies on this road remains active. In any event, we do not believe that option 1 of the Council report, being its discontinuance and sale, is available to the Council at this point in time. And more importantly, that option does not provide my clients with the opportunity to purchase 1/3 of the road of which they have a right to. The planning application currently with Council for consideration reflects my client's interest in purchasing part of the road. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Cherry. So that's the end of public questions for this item. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? Councillor Brand?
Yes, I'd just like to check with officers. Would they confirm that the objections put in by the objectors to this discontinuance and what they're asking for, can we just have that? Could I just have it confirmed that what they're asking for isn't beyond the normal rights and reasonable rights that a neighbour further up the lane would have? Are they asking for more than what would normally be afforded, or is it just exactly what normal rights they have?
Mr.
Yes,
Graffin?
Through you, Madam Mayor.
Have your microphone on?
Yes. I'll sit a bit closer. Yes. The road is a public road and therefore gives public rights, not just to those persons abutting the road. We've found through this process that the owner of 376 Coventry Street is interested in using the road, hasn't probably used it in the past, and is therefore opposing discontinuance and sale.
So nothing extraordinary, I guess, or that's usual. I guess that's what Councillor Brand's trying to understand, whether they're asking for anything abnormal.
No, nothing abnormal.
Thank you, Mr Graffin. Any other questions, councillors? There are none. So we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that or something different? Councillor Copsey to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Bond to second. Councillor Copsey, would you like to speak? Councillor Bond, would you like to speak? Would anyone else like to speak to the motion? Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. We'll move to item 8.6, which is Linden Gallery Upgrade Tender 2059. Councillors, we don't have anyone that's requested to speak. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? I have a question. The BAFO, or the best and final offer, has increased in price on this occasion. I just wanted to find out why, just if you could elaborate please why it's increased, because it normally goes down.
Through you, Madam Mayor. Yes, in some instances the price does go down, but in other instances it does go up. So in this instant it went up because there was further clarification around the provisional sums, which was around contaminated soil, electrical light fittings and in-ground service investigations.
Thank you, Ms Blair. Okay, then, councillors, we have an officer's recommendation. Councillor Brand, you'd like to move that. Councillor Bond to second. Councillor Brand, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to move this. It's a very important renovation to one of council's finest properties, within which one of its finest organisations works for the community. And this will really transform the way that the building works, and I think it's going to be terrific. Reading the qualifications of the tender also, even though there's only one tender, which is rather strange. I think the specialisation that is needed in the tender is probably reflected by the small field of tenderers that tendered for it, but their qualifications seem to be exemplary, and it seems to me that we're heading for something good here. So I'm very pleased to move, but I just want to acknowledge that there's at least 4 that I can see members of the Linden board here tonight, which I just think indicates the value of the relationship and acknowledgement of that from the organisation itself for what's being done. And so very pleased to move it.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Councillor Bond, would you like to speak? Would anyone else like to speak to this motion? Thank you, Councillor Copsey.
Yes, just to echo the sentiments, that it's a project we're very excited about, and I hope that we're now kicking off the process to have a even better and more fit for purpose home for Linden to continue the journey and their contribution to our community and the arts.
Thank you, Councillor Copsey. Anybody else wishing to speak? I'll also say I'm looking forward to the renovation on the Linden building, and recently the councillors met with some of the members of the Linden board, and I found it terrific to see them using this period of homelessness, if I can call it that, to full advantage and trying and testing new things in the art space. So it's really quite exciting to hear. So thank you. So Councillor Brand, would you like to close, or?
No, I've said enough. It's time to vote.
Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Move to item 8.7, which is MMRA Moray Street Bike Lane Upgrade. And councillors, we don't have any members of the public that have requested to speak. I don't think. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers?
Madam Mayor.
Councillor Gross.
I just wanted to ask for sort of like just a wider explanation of the three preferred changes to the options in terms of on-street car parking, the conversion of angled to parallel parking, and the width of the bike lane, particularly that third one, because I'm a bit interested and obsessed with the width of bike lanes.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Ms Doherty.
Through you, Madam Mayor. I'll start with the width of the bike lane. The proposal for the bike link shows the curbside bike lane being slightly, in some sections, about 1 kilometre from Albert Road through to Coventry Street, slightly below guidelines. And what that means is that for that section, it will be difficult for some cyclists to pass. When officers were reviewing that, there was a consideration of some of the broader principles and also acknowledgement that there are other bike lanes which have opportunities for cyclists to pass close by, and they are in Cecil Street and, of course, Kilda Road. The position that we've taken on this is that the broader principles of making sure that there are alternative, doing something different, so not providing a roadside bike lanes all throughout the municipality, so providing options for people who would not normally be comfortable riding on roadside. And so in that sense, the position is that we would be comfortable if the community feedback from the MMRA consultation period indicated that they were comfortable.
That satisfy your question, Councillor Gross? Okay. You want to put on your microphone?
I sort of wanted a bit of clarification on the parking as well and those issues.
So both options provide the bike lane but do result in some loss of car parking. So the roadside looks at about 10 car parking spaces to be removed, and the curbside in its current form has 60 car parking spaces lost. We believe that that can be significantly reduced, and we've gone back to MMRA and indicated there are some design options that we would recommend to them, and they seem open to those discussions, and we'll be pursuing those discussions, particularly in regard to the angled parking, which is located in the northern section of Moray Street. We believe that consideration should be given to making a slight deviation of the bike lane in that section, which would retain, we think, about 20 car parking spaces.
So, Ms Doherty, is the consultation still open? Can people still make a submission to this and choose which option they prefer?
The consultation finishes tomorrow.
Okay, and so if people wanted to check in and make a selection on which option, do you have a website? Is it metrotunnel.vic.gov.au?
Yes, I don't have it in front of me at the moment. Okay. Let me see. metrotunnel.vic.gov.au, and there'll be links that you can go through straight to the Moray Street bike link.
Just search on Moray Street, yes. Okay, so I encourage people to have their say on that. Terrific. Any other questions, councillors? Then we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that? Councillor Copsey to move and Councillor Baxter to second. Councillor Copsey, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, be very happy to. It's a really wonderful position that we're putting. We know that dedicated cycling infrastructure is so important to getting people on their bikes, particularly road users who might feel more vulnerable, women, children, and we want everybody to be able to get on their bike and have really great active transport choices in the city of Port Phillip. The letter of feedback puts a measured but really effective argument for the options. And I'm thank you very much to officers for progressing this and being in close consultation. I do echo Mayor Voss's comment that the consultation is still open, and members of the community who are interested in active transport and infrastructure can still put their views, and I'd encourage them to do so.
Thank you, Councillor Copsey. Councillor Baxter, would you like to speak?
I'd just like to say that separated, protected bike lanes are awesome, and we don't have enough of them, and I'd love to see more. So this is a really, really exciting opportunity, and some of the feedback that I've received from residents and businesses in the area are indicating a huge level of support for this. Not necessarily, I won't tell you about which option they went for, but in general, this sort of idea they find very, very exciting, as do I.
Thank you, Councillor Baxter. Anybody else wishing to speak? I'll also just mention that I would really like to commend the MMRA for listening to Council and the community on to understand which is the best option for the long term. This is a relationship that we're developing in relation to the Domain Tunnel, and MMRA have put this change for a bike lane down Moray Street. That will be one of the legacy items that they will leave for the community as part of this project. So I'd like to thank the officers for the hard work and to ensure our community is looked after, particularly in this area where it's undergoing a lot of confusion and a lot of change. And the project is not just used as a vehicle to get the project delivered for the government, but there is a real benefits for our community as well. So thank you. Councillor Copsey, would you like to close? No? Then I will put that motion. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you. Councillors, we'll go to item 8.8, which is 92 Beach Street and 2 and 4 Princess Street, Port Melbourne. Today we had a planning forum in which we heard from the members of the public about their issues, concerns for and against this project. Councillors, we have had one person that has requested to speak. And on this case, I'm inclined to allow that to happen. So I'd ask for Ms Helen Vines, please, to come forward. Thank you. And Ms Vines, if you turn on the microphone and state your name and suburb for the record, please. So, thank you.
Helen Vines of Port Melbourne. At the last meeting, I raised what I saw as a problem regarding the materials to be used to divide the driveway to the underground car park and the garden belonging to the anchorage. The plans at that time showed vertical wooden slats or poles, and the architect indicated at that time that they could probably do something about that. The latest plans now show horizontal metal slats, and apparently the reason for slatted material was so that car fumes would be able to escape from the car park. Logically, the fumes would be directed into the garden at the anchorage and subsequently into the bedrooms of 90 Beach Street, which are just above the divider, all above the divider. So the new plans showing horizontal plans strips, horizontal metal strips, would do nothing to address the problem. And I think the divider should be of a solid material, such as brick, so that those fumes would be contained.
Thank you, Ms Fines. A councillor may take up the question on your behalf. Councillors, there are no other members of the Republic that will be speaking. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers? Councillor Brand?
I suppose on that particular question just asked, it is a question that I think we should ask an officer to comment on, because I believe that there was, that concession was made and has been included in the plans that are being considered before us now. That's been that modification was made, but maybe the purpose of the modification, I'd be interested to know what the purpose was seen to be and whether it's been fulfilled by or whether this is a new purpose that we haven't understood that needs to be modified, or the design needs to be modified for.
Through you, Madam Mayor, that is covered in proposed condition 1N, and that says the ground floor permeable metal screen located on the eastern boundary deleted and replaced with a solid wall, and that will address the objector concerns.
Thank you. Any other questions, councillors? If not, we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that or something different? Councillor Bond?
Yeah, I'd like to move an alternate recommendation.
You could state the nature of your alternate recommendation. I'll see if I've got a seconder.
Changes are as follows. Additional conditions 1V and 1W. V, the provision of 3 resident visitor car spaces on site. W, level 7 setback from the southern side boundary Beach Street so as to not cast any shadow in excess of the shadow cast from level 6 to the south from 10 a.m. on the 22nd of June. Amended condition 13. Car parking space allocation, a minimum of 28 resident car parking spaces and 3 residential visitor car spaces must be provided on the land for the development to the satisfaction of the responsible authority. A minimum of 1 car space must be provided to each dwelling to the satisfaction of the responsible authority. Additional condition 36. Heritage record, within 3 months after commencement of the hotel tavern use, a record of the previous London hotel must be displayed within the replacement building associated with the hotel tavern to the satisfaction of the responsible authority. The record must include an annotated photographic study of archival quality of the buildings, detailing the elevations and interior of the original London Hotel building and its various alterations and additions to the satisfaction of the responsible authority. And they're the changes.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Brandt, a second. Councillor Bond, would you like to speak to your motion?
Look, I think we all wish the London Hotel had have been able to remain, but that's gone, so we're dealing with the replacement building. Yeah, generally speaking, this is a very good building. It's going to be great to have a drinking establishment of sorts back in that same site, and I think the suggestion from someone this morning of some sort of plaque or recognition to the previous building was a wonderful one. Also, the inclusion of 3 visitors' spaces so that people who visit that building do have somewhere to park and are not taking up additional spaces on the street around that area. And the other condition is the setback of level 7 to the same level as, or the same, so it will have the same impact as level 6 as an alternative to deleting a level off the top of the building. And that will reduce the impact of the forecast shadow across the bicycle lane and the pedestrian lane on the other side of the road, which will address some of the concerns raised this morning from many residents in that area that they felt very strongly about the overshadowing of the public realm across the road from this particular building. So that's why these changes have been made to the officer recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Councillor Brand, would you like to speak to the motion?
Yes, I'd just like to just refer to the history of it a little bit. The VCAT decision that came down, having read that decision, it does seem like a very well balanced and well written and well considered decision, which refused the previous proposal and gave a fair amount of guidance about what would be acceptable and what wouldn't be acceptable in a new proposal. And it was the VCAT members, the tribunal itself, I think, was a very, very experienced and very, I think, sympathetic to both architectural issues and issues of the public good. I think it was a really VCAT at its best, probably. I think the design that has come back with a new set of architects is really been a very, very good response on the whole. It's led to a radical change in the building itself, the main bulk of the building being set a long way back, leaving a three-storey sort of podium form, which has been styled as a hotel, which really I find actually really quite upsetting, because that's exactly where the London Hotel itself, the old one, could have stayed, plugged in at the back to modern facilities. And now we've got a modern version of the London Hotel, and it just does my head in that we don't have the old one there after all of this fuss, that it could have been saved with this new design pretty much. Anyway, that hasn't happened. But the setback of the main bulk of the building has done a lot of good for the residents of number 90 Beach Road, which I think has been a great improvement. It hasn't done very much at all for the residents of 10 Princes Street, and I think that we have put some modifications in which address that to a fair extent. And the question really remains, the big question is how much overshadowing of the foreshore. VCAT was very explicit that even though there is a whole lot of overshadowing on the foreshore, over the bike path, over the pedestrian path in that part, extensive overshadowing, that even though that exists as it is now, that they don't think that is a justification enough to allow the previous amount of overshadowing which was entailed in the previous design, and they said it is too much. It is too extensive, the overshadowing, and I think we have to take that as our guide, that we should be minimising the amount of overshadowing to satisfy what that previous panel was indicating should be done. And I think that at the moment, the way that the proposal is that the amount of overshadowing hasn't been reduced substantially. It looks like about 3/4 they've reduced it by about 1/4, even though they claim 1/2. I think it's a fair, intuitive thing to say it's just been set back a bit, but it still overshadows the bike path, and it still overshadows the pedestrian path. And I just don't think if you sent it back to the same panel, the same tribunal, that they would say, oh, well, that satisfies us. I just don't think that they would in any way say that was a substantial reduction, and that was what they were looking for. They could not approve what was proposed before, and I think they wouldn't approve it now. What they didn't say, though, was that it should be set back. The shadow should be kept back absolutely to the curb line. They said that they expected there'd be some overshadowing, so we haven't got that sort of guidance. I think if we put conditions on this building that ensured that its shadow was cast only to the curb line, that in itself would not have been approved by the previous tribunal. They certainly were saying that they'd be more flexible than that. So finding a place in the middle somewhere, which is a very substantial setback of shadow, but an allowance of some flexibility in the overshadowing of the foreshore, is what we've come up with. We've come up with something which basically says the 6th floor should be what casts the shadow, not the 7th. Ideally, it might have been the 5th floor, but I don't think we would have got that through VCAT, and I don't think VCAT would have approved the 7th either. So somewhere in the middle, we've found a compromise. So I have to apologise, I think, to the people who have passionately supported a complete ban on overshadowing of the foreshore at 10 in the morning. I hope that we've applied enough reasoning and stricture on this for similar decisions in areas where the overshadowing rule is discretionary rather than mandatory. For it to hold up again, that we can say that we have been consistent upholders of foreshore values. To the architects and the developer, I feel very conscious that we have messed up a pretty good, well-composed building to some extent. But I'm not going to teach the architects how to design. I think that they can take it away and probably have the skill to adapt to these new conditions and make it into a very fine building that has the potential of being, and it already is, as proposed. It just doesn't meet these things, which I think are actually, in the long run, how we protect our foreshore amenity. In principle, in practice, these are very small impositions on the public of a little bit of shadowing here next to a big piece of shadow, but in principle, I think we have to stand up for the foreshore and do our best to find something which would certainly stand up in VCAT again if it was sent back to them. So I think that's our guide, and I hope that that is not too unsatisfactory for both sides of this argument. And I need to say to the people in number 10 Princess Street, again, I think the same principle applies. It would have been much nicer for you if we had have set it back a lot more, but I don't think that would stand up, and I think that we've set it back a surprising amount from what I understand from previous cases. So I think we've found some middle ground, maybe a little bit weaselly, but I think it's the best that we're going to do. So I commend this alternative recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Would anyone else like to speak to this motion? I will as well. I'll support this motion. I think just because we've got a maximum height limit of 25.5 doesn't mean that we have to, go all the way to the maximum. Overshadowing our foreshore, our very valuable open space, is incredibly important to me, and I know how much our community values our foreshore, our promenade, our bike paths. We have all sorts of protection for the Yarra River, and we're yet to get that protection for our foreshore. And my view is the mistakes of the past shouldn't be replicated by us tonight. Our obligations under the Local Government Act 3C is that councillors need to make a decision in the best interest for the long term of the whole community. So when you consider that, the foreshore, overshadowing the foreshore, is a very critical piece of this decision. I think I'll leave it there. I'm very supportive of the motion. Thank you. Councillor Bond, would you like to close? Then with that, I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. We'll move to item 8.9, Planning Permits Delegates Report. No members of the public have requested to speak.
Happy to move.
Councillor Gross to move. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Copsey to second. I'm assuming you don't want to speak, so I'll just put that motion. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Now we'll move to item 8.10, which is a review of council delegations to staff, and we have two members of the public that have requested to speak to this item. I'll ask Ms Christina Kinst, please, to come forward. Good evening, Ms Kinst. If you would pop on the microphone and state your name and suburb, please.
Good evening. My name is Christina Kinst. I live in St Kilda. Madam Mayor and councillors, thank you for this opportunity to speak to the St Kilda Sea Baths protocol. First of all, I would like to thank you for listening to the community and for moving to adopt this protocol. The Sea Baths is an important and prominent building on St Kilda's foreshore Crown land. The objective of the protocol is to give councillors, and through them the public, some say in how the Sea Baths complex works and looks for public benefit, as well as for private profit, of course, of the businesses operating in it. Thus, the wording needs to be strong, accurate, and reflect the current situation and planning interpretations. So I believe that continuing the protocol's original wording, that any major land use or major design matters, may not achieve our objective for closer monitoring of sea baths permits, because recently there's been a change in the way the planning guidelines have been interpreted as they apply to the sea baths. And this new interpretation seems to have started with the 2010 request to hold 104 functions on the public space rooftop. Previous function applications had triggered the protocol that existed in the early 2000s. For this one, however, it was argued that as function use was an approved use within the complex, it could spread to any part of the complex without the need for a planning permit. The officers explain it as follows. The application was what is called a secondary consent for an amendment to the approved Sea Baths development plan, bearing in mind the primary consent for the use already exists in the Sea Baths incorporated document, which forms part of the planning scheme, and no major new use was proposed. So in other words, the protocol's major land use was interpreted to mean major new land use, and the protocol was not invoked. And being a secondary consent, only the ward councillor was consulted. The public was not. We simply did not know that public space had been handed over to private operators. Another recent example is an amendment to a liquor licence which sought to increase the number of patrons from 400 plus to about 700 plus. Though this permit was advertised at the Sea Baths, it was easy to miss. Again, the public was unaware that of the doubling of these patrons and that the numbers were being targeted for the rooftop public space. Fortunately, that planning amendment was withdrawn, but if it had not been, we would have ended up with 300 people on the rooftop without the public knowing. Again, the protocol would not have been invoked. So to avoid future confusion, I ask that you consider revising the protocol, replacing the words any major land use or major design matters with the words all land use, design and structural matters, including amendments to the approved Sea Baths development plan, or words to that effect. And I would hope that these words also cover secondary consents and amendments such as I mentioned earlier. I believe we need to keep an eye on the small things at the Sea Baths, not just the big things. We have seen incremental amendments and secondary consents achieve over time major changes at the Sea Baths, changes that don't necessarily have public benefit at their heart. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Kinst. Just wondering if I could Councillor Brand, maybe you could keep those words, or have you got them? Okay. Can I have that, those words? I can give them. Yes.
I've got a better copy.
Oh, thank you. Miss Brenda Forbath, please come forward.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and Councillors. Brenda Forbath, Elwood. I agree with the arguments put forward by Christina Kinst, and I won't go over those again. I also support the proposed amendment that we would like to see to the resolution coming up for a vote tonight, and that is that Council confirms the St Kilda Protocol being that in relation to the St Kilda sea baths, that all land use, design and structural matters, including amendments to the approved sea baths plan, are to be presented to Council for determination following an officer report that provides analysis on the topic. Now, it is incredibly important that for all major developments along the seafront, that the whole of Council deals with those matters. They are key development areas, they're key public utilities, and it isn't appropriate that they be delegated to staff. And that's not in any way to say anything negative about the staff. It's just in terms of the democratic process, those foreshore issues need to come to a full council meeting and need to be debated in public and be voted on in public. We're very concerned that we will get into a debate at a later stage with the word major, which is in the council officer proposition, and there'll be endless debates about what's major and what's not. So I think that we have to ensure that we have a very clear resolution, that all matters will come to the council for their consideration, and certainly at a later date we would be, I know this resolution only pertains to the sea baths, but certainly at a later stage we would be certainly wanting to raise with councillors the need for all major decisions concerning foreshore matters come to this chamber. One that comes to mind particularly is Waterfront Place, and I know that that's been delegated. Now that's a site that has been full of controversy and has been backwards and forwards to many panels and experts and so forth, and that is something that needs to be in this chamber and needs to be debated and considered openly. I won't say anything more. Christina Kinst has really covered a lot of the issues to do with the sea baths, and I endorse her comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Forbath. Councillors, that's the end of public questions on this item. Do you have any questions of the officers? Councillor Brand?
Just as to what the process of I mean, I have an alternative recommendation in front of me on my phone, but what is the process of getting it up onto the screen?
Are you foreshadowing?
I am if I were to foreshadow,
words?
which I am. I'm foreshadowing an alternative recommendation.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm asking for questions at the moment, but
Okay.
So do you have any questions on the delegations? I guess the question I have was put by Ms Forbath in that, is there any possibility of the sea baths issue occurring elsewhere and not being brought to council, being a major, any major development? And I guess the other question I had, which is probably two, is, are we confident that all past resolutions have been reviewed and are captured in this report? Which is probably a question for you, Mr CEO. But perhaps, Mr Borg, if you could answer the first one.
In relation to the first question, Madam Mayor, and in relation to the statements of the last speaker, the 1 to 7 Waterfront Place was a major development, absolutely, but we have delegation to refuse applications, and that's something that was discussed with councillors in relation to that application, and whilst it was a major application, it was refused, consistent with our delegation.
And through you, Madam Mayor, I'm as confident as a new CEO can be that all previous resolutions have been captured.
Thank you.
Through you, Madam Mayor, can I add to that response is that one of the reasons we have included the additional 3 attachments in the delegations is they were resolutions, a bit similar to the sea baths protocol, as I understand it. That was lost through changes of staff and changes of personnel. So we now have incorporated in the instrument of delegation as a recommendation. That will assist us knowing as to what the requirements are as officers. So if I leave or other officers leave, there'll be a history and certainly a trail in which to deal with these applications.
Thank you, Mr Borg, and that's why I asked the second question. Are we confident that we've got them all and there's nothing else that's sort of been lost from years ago that, is not captured in the report? And I've had that assurance. Councillors, any further questions? Then we have a officer's recommendation, although Councillor Brand, I know that you've foreshadowed an alternative recommendation, so I'll go to you first.
Okay, the alternative recommendation that I foreshadow is, in all regards, for the first 265 pages of the report, that everything remains the same, and it's just the very last page that that I would want to alter slightly.
So we might have you.
Through you, Madam Mayor, if I can assist, I think you're seeking an amendment to 1.1.2, which is that on page 1.12.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well, I don't have the number on my screen, but if you have, I know what you mean. Yes, exactly. That is it.
So, Councillor Brand, would you please read that amendment,
yes.
And we'll see if we've got a seconder.
That Council confirms, however we start that series of recommendations, that Council confirms the St Kilda Protocol, being that in relation to the St Kilda sea baths, that all land uses, design and structural matters, including amendment to the approved sea baths development plan, are to be presented to Council for determination following an officer report that provides analysis of the topic. Other than refusals of planning permit applications, amendments and secondary consents following consultation with ward councillors. Would you like me to speak to that?
No, they're your words and you're happy with those words?
Yes, I'm happy with those.
So I'll ask for a seconder. Councillor Bond to second. Councillor Brand, please speak to your motion. Okay.
Ms Kinst has actually given a good outline of why it needed to be slightly different from what was printed in the original officer's recommendation, mainly because the practice of how changes in land use are interpreted now are a little bit different from what the historical practice was and what the historical wording of that protocol was. So it needs some sort of updating to cover current conditions. which means that basically everything will be brought to, every change there, whether they might be small changes but nevertheless significant changes, will be brought to council to determine and have a look. But I've added on another little bit at the end, which says that really, in consultation with officers, that we could probably take out of that list things that were going to be refused under delegation, just automatically refused under delegation. I don't think if the officers are inclined to refuse something that it needs to necessarily go through the whole monthly cycle into to come up to councillors to endorse something which is very straightforward and it's not a threat of approving something that we don't agree with. Except that the officers, even in refusing something, will have a word to the ward councillors, all three of us, or whoever's available. But anyway, all three of us, just to check that that's fine. So it's a sort of a double check on a double check, just so that we don't get every single thing that could go through without any worry. I think that sort of helps the main intent of that change.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Councillor Bond, would you like to speak? Would anyone else like to speak to this motion? Councillor Copsey.
Yes, I'm broadly supportive. I guess I just wanted to note that if I'm reading the intent of the alternate recommendation as being capturing some of the community concerns that we've heard voiced in the chamber tonight, I do wonder whether the inclusion of secondary consents in that exemption covers the concerns that have been raised this evening. But I'll leave that with the councillors who have put the motion, and I think we can't probably amend it at this stage.
Maybe there's a point of clarification that you could ask at this point.
Yes,
I guess
I would ask whether the officers, in the officers' opinion, after hearing the concerns raised by the community this evening, whether that secondary consents carve-out that's presented in the final sentence creates a bit of a loophole that community members might consider problematic. Mr. Borg?
Through you, Madam Mayor, no, I don't think that is problematic at that point. But what you can do is to tighten it up a little bit is in the first part, in the second line of the sentence where we include amendments, but we also include secondary consents as a consideration there. So it's a consideration of approving them. So you add the secondary consents into the approval, and then when you are officers are looking at refusing, you can refuse a secondary consent if officers are not satisfied. So that will then it'll cover all aspects and all matters we need to deal with.
So, Councillor Brand, would you like to include that?
I'd be very happy with that alteration.
Councillor Bond, as the seconder, are you comfortable with that? So we'll just get that added in. So that's amendment and secondary consent to the approved, as I understand the wording. So, Councillor Copsey, you can continue your...
Thank you. So that, yes, I had misunderstood. So thank you for that point of clarification. That was very worthwhile. So I'd just like to say that delegation is a fact of life in an organisation as busy and big and large as the City of Port Phillip, and we are transparent about the types of decisions that are left to delegation. I thank the community members who've raised specific issues that we've been able to address this evening, and they do relate to really important topics that are of community interest and community import. So we are very pleased to consider them as a council, I'd say, generally speaking.
I will just wait till that's typed in. Okay, Councillor Brand, are you able to confirm again that that's correct? Including
amendments and secondary consents to Yeah, I think that's great.
You're happy, Councillor Bond? Okay, thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to this motion? Then, Councillor Brand, would you like to close?
Yes, I'll just say that the sea baths is a very special case. It's really what precipitated the entire urban design framework when the state government seemed to be doing a pretty ham-fisted job of dealing with it as a project that was going off the rails, and it sort of was emblematic of where the foreshore itself was going, and it made council determined to bring the whole foreshore under some unified control, and hence the urban design framework and the St Kilda foreshore urban design framework. But the sea bath has always remained outside that, and always operating under a very weirdly loose and obscure and difficult instrument to handle planning under, which is the consent notice, written in about not the consent notice, in 1994. And we've always struggled with it, and it's always had protocols attached to it, and it takes a lot of very intense local historical knowledge to know how the sea baths has been handled in the past, and of course knowledge does die, sort of over a period, and this is actually restoring it into print, maybe for the first time into print, in a certain sense, and it's something which is necessary at the moment, I think, for council to keep a special eye on this particular place. I'm very happy that it's been acknowledged and that it's been included in this giant package of delegation. And I'm sorry, I'm not making any more comment on the rest of the delegation.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. So with that, I'll put that motion. All those in favour? Carried unanimously. Thank you. So we'll move now to item 8.11, which is the appointment of acting mayor for the period of the mayor's absence, very important business, from Thursday the 5th of October to Sunday the 15th of October. So, councillors, we have no members of the public that have requested to speak to this point. Do you have any questions of the officers? So we have a recommendation that needs filling in. So do I have someone to move and nominate? Somebody? Councillor Brand?
I would nominate the Deputy Mayor, Councillor Copsey.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Gross? Would you like to speak to that, Councillor Brand? I assume you'll accept that, Councillor Copsey.
I am available and I will accept the nomination.
There stands my argument, I guess. I do think that having a deputy mayor, I've been a deputy mayor myself. Thank you. I certainly valued. It meant a lot to me in my service to the community. But I just think it's a pretty automatic sort of thing that if we have a deputy mayor that they are there to deputise, and I certainly, and if they're available, then I think it's the natural intent of having that position. And I think it'd be good to share it around if the deputy mayor isn't available either, or if we decide otherwise. But I think it's a straightforward procedure that we have anticipated by having a deputy mayor.
Thank you, Councillor.
And I think that she's a very fine deputy mayor too.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Councillor Gross, would you like to speak?
Yeah, I think it's important in the conduct of business of council to try and get a number of decisions which happen in a straightforward, non-contentious way. As the agenda for tonight and every other night shows, there are plenty of opportunities for us to engage in disagreement and discourse which leads to acrimony and unfortunate outcomes. So I think that the Deputy Mayor is not a position that's acknowledged in the Local Government Act. But as Councillor Brand said, the name Deputy implies the chief role, which is to stand up in the absence of the Mayor. And it's really a position and title of convenience. And I would suggest that it's an automatic, non-contentious decision generally that, you know, if the Deputy Mayor is available, no matter what one believes, that should be the automatic process. And having thought about it for the last 18 hours, that's where I've come.
Thank you, Councillor Gross. Would anyone else like to speak? Then I will now... Councillor Copsey.
I feel I should just say I acknowledge what Councillors Brand and Gross have said. I don't take the position lightly, even though it's automatic, and I'll be exercising all of my skill and best endeavours to fill the very big shoes left when Mayor Voss is on leave as acting Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Copsey. Then I will now put that motion. All those in favour? That motion's carried. Thank you. So I'll move now to item 8.12, which is Amendment C 150, request for interim heritage controls at 77 Park Street, South Melbourne. So I'd like to ask Mr. Peter Small, please, to come forward. Mr. Small, just pop the microphone on. I think it's on, and if you could...
Yep. So, Peter Small, I'm a planning consultant with Urbis, Collins Street, Melbourne. I'm here on behalf of my client, and really this is just an issue of a little bit of procedural fairness from our perspective. This matter, or this property, has been in the ownership of my client or a member of his client for about 20 years. At no stage through that period has there ever been raised an issue of heritage importance. The application for planning permit was lodged with Council back in March. No stage was it ever raised of any heritage issue. The only time that's been or come to pass is of recent times when a Section 29A application under the Building Act was lodged, which is for demolition of the building. At that point, that triggers the Council's interest in it, and Council sought to and has written to the Minister asking for interim controls. Now, interim controls are generally only used when there's a fear of the building being demolished. Now, having lodged the application for demolition, I understand that, but my client has instructed me to advise the Council that he's prepared to withdraw the Section 29A request and to give an undertaking in writing to the Council that the demolition will not be pursued. The reason we want some time is that we just don't know what this means to us. We don't know what legal ramifications are. We don't know what the impact in terms of the planning scheme is. And given that we've only had 2 days' notice of this amendment, we just think it's procedurally unfair for Council to proceed forward with this at this point in time. And what we seek from Council is a deferment of the matter until their meeting in, I think it's the 18th of October or somewhere in that vicinity, which would give us time to obtain the appropriate advice from our legal counsel, to understand the ramifications of that advice in terms of the current application, because we don't know what we don't know. And for Council to proceed forward at this point in time, we just think is procedurally unfair, and we would ask for the Council to therefore adjourn this matter to give us time to understand it. Understanding, of course, that you'd want an assurance from us that we're not going to proceed in any way down the path of demolition, and as I said, my client's happy to give that to you. So that's really the nub of our case.
Thank you, Mr. Small. Councillors, do you have any questions of the officers?
Yes.
Councillor Brand.
I would like an officer to respond to that question. Well, yes, I'd like an officer to respond to that particular question. I suppose with particular comment on what the interim order allows, and if we can, within having lodged I've forgotten the right terminology for it, for what we've done.
We've lodged a request for interim controls.
All right, we've lodged that. I think that within that we can extend, every opportunity to the applicant for getting their their case together and their consultation together, and we're not actually preventing that from happening.
So the question is,
I'm wanting to ask, how that request for time to organise themselves can or can't be fulfilled within the structure of having already lodged the interim request.
Ms Turgeon.
Through you, Madam Mayor, as Councillor Brand points out, there has already been a request to the Minister for Planning for interim controls to be applied to the site. So suspending Council's or deferring Council's decision tonight would not necessarily stop that. Council would need to make a resolution to withdraw that request, to put that on hold. The opportunity to put interim controls is really just a holding pattern, and there's an opportunity through the request for us to apply permanent controls to the site is where the consideration of development interests and effects would take place. So there's an opportunity through the permanent control process and amendment, which involves formal public exhibition and the opportunity for interested parties to make written submissions and, if necessary, to provide their own expert evidence, and then that would be referred to an independent panel if there is still a dispute in relation to the outcome. So the permanent planning controls are really the process whereby that matter can be considered in full and with all parties having an opportunity to comment.
So, Ms Turgeon, in terms of the claim of procedural fairness has not been applied in this case, you're saying that that's not the case. There is still plenty of time and every opportunity to put their case.
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes, the proposal of permanent controls, which would follow the interim controls, assuming that the Minister supports both the application of interim controls and us proceeding with an amendment to propose permanent controls, would be the process, that second process, the permanent controls, would be the process where everyone has an opportunity to have a say in the process. So interim controls are effectively a holding pattern. In the event that the full heritage assessment that Council is now undertaking comes back and advises that the property is not of heritage significance at a local level, then we would withdraw that application to the Minister for the interim controls and not pursue the permanent controls.
Mr Small has requested that we withdraw it now. If that was to occur, but we wanted to then reinstate the interim controls or the request, what would the Minister think? And would this disadvantage Council or the community, or what would be your view on that?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I guess the applicant has suggested they would give an undertaking not to demolish the site. There would obviously need to be, if we withdrew the request for interim controls, then the suspending of the 29A application for demolition under the Building Act would not be able to continue. I understand that the applicant has suggested that they would give their undertaking to Council, but I guess that still proposes some degree of risk. As I say, the interim controls is really a holding pattern to ensure that the building isn't demolished, which the applicant is in fact saying he would offer to do anyway. So the suggestion is that we could wait till the permanent control process to ensure that he has a full process to have his say and reflect that.
Thank you. Any further questions, councillors? Then we have an officer's recommendation. Do I have a mover for that or something different? Councillor Copsey to move. Councillor Gross to second. Councillor Copsey, would you like to speak? Councillor Gross, would anyone else like to speak to the motion? Councillor Brand?
Yes, this is an entirely regrettable situation to be in, and I really feel it's pointless of me to say, It would be pointless for us to say, but I really feel sorry for the developer on this particular point. But the purpose of interim heritage protection is in cases where something ostensibly, obviously, is a candidate for heritage protection, and in this case, heritage protection, the consideration of heritage protection to me wins out, and it's a sign that the whole system we have for protecting heritage, which starts off on the front foot with heritage controls and studies done and everything listed, and then has a series of filters until you get right to the back foot where you have this last line of defence. It has actually worked. It has worked better than it worked last time when we tried to get interim heritage controls for buildings that already had a demolition permit. This one hasn't got a demolition permit yet, so the system is working better than it did at its worst. It's so obvious that a church like this, a century ago, communities, cities express themselves architecturally through major public buildings like town halls, stations, schools and churches. And each city has probably half a dozen examples of those as their chief architectural expressions of their time. And this looks to me as one of them. It looks like it's been driven from somewhere and parked in a parking lot in an obscure block somewhere and forgotten. I don't know how it got to this stage, but it is clearly a candidate for protection, and I feel very, very sorry that it's ended up so late in the piece, but I'm very sure that it's the right decision to at least consider it.
Thank you, Councillor Brand. Anybody else? Councillor Bond.
I was going to say something very similar to Councillor Brand, only shorter. I've got a bit of sympathy, or a lot of sympathy for the owner of this property. To find out about this on Friday is, as I said, I can't imagine being in your position when you think you're about to commence a development and all of a sudden this is, I guess, sprung on you from out of nowhere. We're not making a decision here tonight to impose heritage restrictions or an overlay on this particular building. All we're doing is buying a bit of time while someone has a look at it, and if it does have heritage, we should protect it, and if it doesn't, you'll be able to pick up where you left off in however long this takes, hopefully not too long for your sake, because I understand you've been at this for a couple of years already, and only apologise for the delay, but heritage is really important and we need to have a look at it, and if it does have heritage, we need to preserve it.
Thank you, Councillor Bond. Anybody else wishing to speak? Councillor Copsey, close? No? Then I'll put that motion. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. We'll go to item 9. Councillors, notices of motion. There are none. Item 10, reports by councillor delegates. Councillors, are there any reports from you in any of your activities? No? Okay, then we'll move to item 11, urgent business. There is none. We'll move to item 12, which is confidential matters. Mr. Chick, can you... So councillors understand there's a motion to defer. We don't need to go into confidential to pass that motion. So
motion.
That's right. So if the motion fails, we then go into confidential, but at this stage we don't need to. So Councillor Gross, you have a motion to defer.
So you just want a simple, straightforward motion to defer, not all of the other crap I put in. Okay. With a heavy heart and great regret, I will move a motion to defer for 2 weeks, the MMRA discussion.
So Councillor Gross, you have moved a motion to defer the MREP item to the 19th, Tuesday the 19th of September.
Correct.
Do I have a seconder for that? Councillor Bond to second. So I don't think we need to have any discussion or commentary around that. I'm just going to put that to the vote. All those in favour? That's carried. Thank you very much. So there being no further business, I declare the meeting closed. Thank you. Good night.